I'm ready.
Stand by!
Hello, YouTube. I'm Joey Russo, disabled competitive pistol shooter and retired range master, here with the first episode of the REVO Chronicles. As you might infer from the title, in these videos I'll be running a revolver. You know, those antique roadshow guns with a round magazine in the middle, like this Ruger GP100. Hey, I'm only kidding. In fact, my first centerfire handgun was a Ruger Security 6 357 I purchased late in my teens. And through the years, I've owned and used many revolvers. From this snub-nosed J-frame I carried as a backup on patrol as a police officer, to this scope 44 Magnum I hunted with, and everything in between. 22s, 38s, 357s, 44s, and 45s. Heck, even cap and ball. I actually dig wheel guns. Now, as a firearms instructor, I had to maintain a modicum of skill using revolvers, qualifying annually and being able to teach folks how to run them. But I have never seriously competed with a wheel gun until now. As we start this REVO journey, I think it is important to emphasize the principles of executing the shooting motor program with a handgun do not change. Regardless if I'm using a pistol or revolver, as I described in my earlier videos, we still use our formula, 3 T's plus T.D.A.R, to determine our shooting solution. For example, if 3 T's plus T.D.A.R determines I have a controlled target, then I will consciously execute the shooting motor program using closed-loop motor control, where I can perform slower, precise movements by evaluating and modifying the movement as it is occurring using my brain's comparator function. This is where the controlled trigger press, or CTP, lives. On the other hand, if 3 T's plus T.D.A.R determines I have an accelerated target, then I can get away with subconsciously executing the shooting motor program using open loop motor control, where I can quickly perform less precise but faster movement. This is where the accelerated trigger press, or ATP, lives. Now, what does change when using a revolver will be the techniques employed, or in other words, how I run the double action trigger in the controlled or accelerated engagement. Let me demonstrate.
Pistol movement waypoints. When discussing applying shooting motor program principles to trigger manipulation techniques in my previous videos, I did so within the context of using a pistol. To quickly review, the pistol has 3 trigger movement waypoints. The first is touch, where the trigger finger merely contacts the face of the trigger, depressing the trigger safety tab if present, like on this Glock. After taking up the pre-travel or slack in this area here, the next waypoint in trigger travel we encounter is the wall. At the wall, the trigger stops easily moving rearward. Any additional pressure applied will eventually cause the pistol to discharge. The wall is important because when consciously pressing the trigger using closed-loop motor control for a precise controlled trigger press for maximum accuracy, we do so from the wall waypoint. The last trigger movement waypoint we encounter is after the pistol fires, at the rearmost of trigger travel, and it is reset. As soon as possible after the pistol goes off, we want to efficiently reset the trigger, allowing it to return forward at least past the wall waypoint to prepare for shot number next. Double action revolver trigger manipulation. Movement waypoints. Similar to the pistol, the double action revolver also has trigger movement waypoints. Again, the first is touch, where the trigger finger just contacts the face of the trigger at rest at its forwardmost position. Now, unlike the pistol, the double action revolver really doesn't have pre-travel or slack to easily take up. The double action trigger has comparatively heavy, constant, or even increasing stacking resistance to rearward movement. So instead of a wall waypoint to work from during a controlled trigger press, we will instead work from the point in the trigger's travel where the cylinder rotates or indexes a chamber into alignment with the bore. This is called the index waypoint. The rotating cylinder indexing with the bore provides both a tactile and even peripherally visual consistent waypoint in the long double action trigger's journey. I will soon demonstrate what working from the index waypoint during a double action controlled trigger press looks like. But first, off here to the right, you'll see a parenthetical reference to the Leopard staging waypoint. This is acknowledging the contribution of Lieutenant John D. Leopard of the Saginaw, Michigan Police Department, whose article, Double Action Revolver Shooting, was included in the 1938 6th edition of the book, Burning Powder, featuring articles compiled by Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Wesson, grandson of Smith & Wesson founder Daniel Wesson, and contributor to the development and marketing of the .357 Magnum cartridge. Here you can see Colonel Wesson with the skull of a moose he harvested in 1935 with the then new .357 Magnum. Lieutenant Leopard was an accomplished bullseye target shooter using double action when most were using single action. His technique was using the trigger finger lightly touching the rear part of the trigger guard as a physical gauge by which to consistently pre-stage the double action trigger prior to the hammer falling as shown here. While obviously not the same exact technique as I have described, the goal of creating a reliable waypoint in the trigger's travel by which to then perform a precise controlled trigger press in double action is the same. And his article was the earliest I found documenting the concept. So much respect to Lieutenant Leopard. Our final double action revolver trigger movement waypoint is reset. And just like the pistol, it is reached at the end of the trigger's rearward travel after the hammer falls and the shot is fired. And here again, immediately after the shot, we need to turn the revolver back on by allowing the trigger to return fully forward to at least the touch waypoint. In the slides that follow, I'll demonstrate movement through all these double action revolver trigger waypoints. Consciously executed double action controlled trigger press. Starting first with the consciously executed via closed loop motor control double action controlled trigger press, or CTP for short, we will be visiting all of our trigger waypoints as we make the long journey to a highly accurate double action shot. As the below video plays, notice the slight pause at the index waypoint before we then start an ever increasing in trigger finger pressure, never stopping roll to the shot. Just like with the pistol, once the hammer falls and the revolver goes off, we want to immediately reset the trigger, but in this case, allowing it to move all the way forward up to the touch waypoint. This is significantly different than with the pistol trigger, where we only needed to allow the trigger to reset forward to the wall waypoint. This is why pistol shooters new to double action revolvers will often short stroke their triggers by not allowing full reset back up to the touch waypoint. To avoid short stroking, I often end up leaving the trigger completely, contacting the inside front of the trigger guard to ensure I fully reset the trigger. Subconsciously executed double action accelerated trigger press. Next, let's look at the subconsciously executed via open loop motor control double action accelerated trigger press, or ATP for short. Since accuracy is less demanding, I don't need precise trigger movement. Speed is the priority in this case, so from the touch waypoint, we will be bypassing the index waypoint altogether, quickly stroking past it to rapidly fire the revolver, and then efficiently resetting to be ready to shoot again. As the below video plays, Notice again, after the hammer falls, you will see the quick full travel forward reset up to the touch waypoint. So when it comes to burning accelerated targets down using ATP with a revolver, remember, like Billy Squire said, just do the stroke. The Reset Open Loop Motor Program. I want to reiterate, reset is not part of an accelerated or controlled trigger press. It's its own separate, subconsciously executed open loop motor program, always completed as quickly as possible and independent of how you are running the trigger. Again, every double action shot, whether accelerated or controlled, must start with rearward motion of the trigger from either the touch or index waypoints, never with forward motion. Beginning shots with a reset has been referred to as click banging, which is a real problem with Glock pistols' strong tactile and loud reset click, or pinning the trigger to the rear. There is no such thing as a controlled reset, yet as an instructor I have seen exactly that, particularly on a controlled target when CTP is warranted, where a student will improperly accelerate the trigger to the rear, firing the handgun, then holding the trigger back after the shot, then slowly resetting the trigger, which is entirely back-asswards, and it has no place when working a handgun trigger. Remember, as long as the trigger is held rearward, the handgun is turned off. Trigger press and the Reset Open Loop Motor Program. When it comes to accuracy and speed, the higher quality of the trigger press made will normally equate to higher accuracy attained, which is why when accuracy is the priority, we use conscious control to precisely manipulate the trigger. Speed is a byproduct of trigger reset. The quicker you can turn the gun back on, the sooner you can press the trigger again, which is why we subconsciously reset the trigger as soon as possible after every shot. Trigger control spectrum. Alright, from my earlier video on the topic, here's a familiar graphic to help now illustrate double action revolver accelerated and controlled trigger press attributes. First off, remember that pure accelerated trigger press and pure controlled trigger press represent polar opposites in what is a variable spectrum of trigger control. In illustrating the spectrum of trigger control concept, I like to use a radio dial as an analogy, where accelerated is on the left end and controlled is on the right end. Starting here on the left with what is our default means of completing all body movements. Whether simple or complex movements, by design we want to subconsciously, using open loop motor control, perform them. Most of the time this is a good thing. For example, in the realm of subconscious open loop motor control is where the potential for multitasking exists. Think a Windows-based operating system. Consider how arduous it would be if we had to consciously control routine movements such as walking. We would have to think of and perform each step in sequence. Shift weight to right leg, lift left leg up, step forward, place left foot down, etc. But there are no free rides. In exchange for being able to multitask and rapidly perform movements without consciously thinking about them, we lose available precision within the movement. This is where the accelerated trigger press, or simply ATP, lives. We conceptualize the accelerated double action revolver trigger movement as a rapid stroke. The ATP effective range on an 8-inch target for most shooters is from point blank to approximately 7 to 10 yards. Using open loop to subconsciously execute the shooting motor program is faster than using closed loop conscious control. This is due to less processing demand placed on the brain during the movement. All we are doing in open loop is hitting a play button to quickly complete a pre-programmed movement, There is no quality control at the time the movement is being performed. Based on most shooters' 3 T's, using ATP is reserved for what is deemed an easier target. Think T.D.A.R in the shooting solution formula. The priority on this end of the trigger control spectrum is speed. Recognizing the conscious mind's limitation of only being able to focus on one task at a time, when shooting accelerated using subconscious control, since we will be aggressively running the gun, we consciously focus on our grip structure. Now, to the right end of the spectrum, we have consciously executed movements using closed-loop motor control. Due to the effort required by the brain to perform precise movements, closed-loop motor control lacks the ability to multitask. The conscious mind is a DOS-based operating system. With practice, it might be able to perform single tasks efficiently, but they will only be able to be executed sequentially. To use closed-loop motor control to perform any movements consciously and with high movement precision first requires a decision not to use the body's default subconscious open-loop system of control. This is perhaps the most important aspect of understanding how we execute the shooting motor program and how to leverage that understanding into improved performance. Shooters lacking this knowledge are doomed to living in their default subconscious execution of the shooting motor program with all of its limitations, particularly when it comes to accuracy demanding shots. This is where the controlled trigger press, or simply CTP, lives. We conceptualize the controlled double action revolver trigger movement as efficiently getting to the index waypoint and then continuously, deliberately rolling the trigger to the shot. The CTP effective range on an 8-inch target for most shooters starts from the point where ATP effectiveness drops off at approximately 7 to 10 yards and then extends out to greater distances. Using closed loop to consciously execute the shooting motor program is slower than using open loop subconscious control. This is due to the greater processing demands placed on our brain to use the comparator function to evaluate trigger finger movement as it is occurring, modifying and or even stopping and then restarting the movement if necessary. Based on most shooters' 3 T's, using CTP is reserved for what is deemed a harder target. Think T.D.A.R in the shooting solution formula. The priority on this end of the spectrum is accuracy. Recognizing the conscious mind's limitation of only being able to focus on one task at a time when shooting is in closed-loop motor control, we consciously focus on trigger manipulation. Returning to our radio dial, while we have pure ATP on one end and pure CTP on the other end, the question is, in balancing speed and accuracy, what's in between them? Conceptualizing the double action revolver trigger manipulation. Final. As you watch the below video, ask yourself, what type of double action trigger manipulation is this? Is it pure accelerated trigger press? No, it's far too deliberate a movement to be subconsciously executed using open loop motor control. Is it pure controlled trigger press? No, because we are not visiting the index or staging waypoint. It is a hybrid, combining the accelerated trigger press, faster stroking movement with the controlled trigger press, more precise closed-loop motor control. So, it will be faster than pure controlled, but likely not as accurate. Or, said another way, it will be slower than pure accelerated, but likely more accurate. This is an example of what the middle of the trigger control spectrum radio dial looks like.
All right. Having reviewed how to apply the shooting motor principles with a revolver, let's see how well I did at an ASI match using my Ruger GP100 357. Stage 1 serves as a warning of how not to eject brass from your cylinder, especially when running a non-moon clip wheel gun like my Ruger GP100 357. When it comes time to eject brass, we want to do so using a single positive push on the ejector rod. What you don't want to do is repeatedly pump the ejector rod like you're pumping mustard on a corn dog at the county fair. Pumping the ejector rod can cause a case to slip under the ejector star, like shown here, inducing a stoppage. Remember, the difference between a malfunction and a stoppage is a malfunction is able to be remedied quickly by the operator without the use of tools, efficiently getting the gun back in action. A stoppage, on the other hand, is more complex, taking more time and likely requiring tools to clear and get the gun running again. Okay, let's roll tape.
Stage 1, on the street. Unlimited scoring. Best 6 hits on target 1, then best 2 hits on targets 2 through 4. Reload required between first and last shot.
Now, as you watch the stage videos, you'll see my identifying the reload technique I'm using as the StressFire reload. StressFire is referring to the reload technique described by Ayoob in his book of the same title, StressFire, Volume 1 of Gunfighting for Police, Advanced Tactics and Techniques. I bought my first copy of this book in the late 80s, the same time when I purchased my first revolver, that Ruger Security 6 I mentioned earlier. Not long after, while serving in the Army at my first duty assignment in Germany, a group of 4 of us planned on transitioning out of the Army after our enlistments were up and going into law enforcement. We all purchased Smith & Wesson revolvers, regularly went to the nearby Rod and Gun Club range, and wore out that book, reading and rereading, dog-earing pages for easy reference as we learned how to run our revolvers. Ultimately, I think 2 of us would wind up in law enforcement, but I digress. As the master himself, Ayoob, demos, the StressFire reload technique has the advantage of being a reliable means to speed load any size of revolver with any length of ejector rod. And for this reason, this was the technique I would later teach my own students. Even though full size, the Ruger GP100 I'm now using in competition has a relatively short ejector rod, which doesn't fully eject cases without that positive push which StressFire provides. By the way, I'll link to Mass's original video, which is definitely worth the watch, in the description below. However, everything in life is a give and take, and StressFire, while reliable and the best technique for serious duty defense use, is not the most efficient reload technique for competition. This is because both hands are involved in the ejecting of cases. Once I move into a Smith & Wesson revolver for competition, I will likely adopt another, more efficient competition reload technique, so stay tuned. Alright, let's see how I did on this stage.
Stage 2, accosted. Unlimited scoring, best 2 hits, reload required between first and last shot. Shooter starts with loaded gun on barrel, hands up in surrender position.
Distance, the D in T.D.A.R, is of course one of the shot metrics in the shooting solution formula. Stage 3's first target array provides a good example of ever-increasing distance equating to ever-increasing controlled trigger press. You can hear how I become more deliberate on the trigger as I engage the 3 targets from near to far. Let's check it out.
Stage 3, attack on the neighborhood. Unlimited scoring, best 2 hits. Reload required between first and last shot.
Stage 4's first 2 targets on the left and right are actually 4 separately scored targets. 2 body targets on left and right, and then 2 head targets on left and right. This is a target configuration unique to ASI and is a means to create 2 separate targets using only 1 piece of cardboard. Once again, you can definitely tell as I adjust the radio dial of the trigger control spectrum using open loop ATP on the much easier body shots, then moving to a more deliberate closed loop CTP on the harder headshots. Had some dadgum terrible glare on the last array and missed the right steel popper, but fortunately I had 1 round still in the cylinder to come back and quickly make it up. Sorry there's no third-person video on this one, but you can still dig it.
Stage 4, double triple. Unlimited scoring, best 2 hits on targets 1, 3, and 5, and best 1 hit on targets 2 and 4. Steel must fall. Reload required between first and last shot.
Yeah, that sucked.
Arm is back. Here he comes. 1-2. Swing and a miss.
Stage 5 started with some longer distance steel pepper poppers, and based on the 3 T's plus T.D.A.R formula, I definitely made the decision during my stage walkthrough to consciously execute the shooting motor program using closed loop motor control, and I went 1 shot for 1 hit on both. There was also another one of those ASI body head combo targets, and you can again hear me flow the trigger control spectrum with ATP to the body and then a CTP to the head. But the big takeaway from this stage is when I encounter a failure to fire malfunction. Of course, Murphy being in full effect on the last target with the last shot and the last live round in the cylinder. So, when you have a failure to fire malfunction with a revolver, you have a couple of choices. If you know you have more live rounds in the cylinder, you can just press the trigger again and hopefully the next round will fire. But if, like me, you're on your last round, you can either Russian roulette it and dry fire your way back around to the questionable round and hope hitting the primer a second time will make it go off, or you perform a reload, putting 6 fresh rounds in the cylinder and re-engaging the target. I chose to do the latter. Let's watch the drama.
Stage 5, steel and heads. Unlimited scoring, best 2 hits. Steel must fall. Reload required between first and last shot.
Based on distance, accuracy, and risk metrics of the shooting solution formula, that is the D, A, and R in T.D.A.R, Stage 6 was all controlled targets and shot entirely with varying degrees of conscious closed-loop motor control, from the middle of the trigger control spectrum radio dial all the way to the right end. On the last target in the center array, with a no-shoot obscuring most of the target area, I flowed into pure CTP, working the trigger from the index waypoint and then rolling to the precision shot. I think Lieutenant Leppert would have been proud. Let's go to the video.
Stage 6, bang, bang. Unlimited scoring, best 2 hits. Steel must fall. Reload required between first and last shot.
Why not? Whew! And that's the match. It's been a while since I ran a revolver, and man, it shows. But despite my rusty manipulations, I was able to shoot a clean match, taking most accurate iron sights, placing first out of 11 other iron sight shooters, using both pistols and revolvers. Again, folks, when it comes to hitting your target, it's all about understanding how the body completes complex motor movements, like the shooting motor program, and then basing techniques, which can change, for example, depending on whether you're using a pistol or a revolver, on sound motor principles, which never change. I'm Joey Russo, disabled competitive pistol shooter and retired range master. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care of yourself, be kind to others, and remember, where there's a will, there's always a way. Don't let anything keep you from pursuing your passion.